Picture a bucket. Not a compost bin, not a worm farm. Just a 5-gallon plastic bucket with a lid sitting in the corner of a kitchen. Inside it, coffee grounds, eggshells, wilted lettuce, the peels from last night's sweet potatoes, a fistful of rice that went bad. Stuff you'd normally just toss into a pile and forget for 6 months. Now, picture that same material 3 weeks later, transformed into some of the darkest, most nutrient-dense compost amendment you've ever seen. Not raw, not slimy, not rotting in the traditional, horrible-smelling sense. It smells almost like dark bread, rich, earthy, fermented. And when you work it into your soil, your plants respond within days. That bucket is practicing something that farmers in Korea and Japan have been doing for centuries. And it's not the compost pile that's doing the heavy lifting. It's what happens before the pile, a fermentation stage that most Western gardeners have never heard of, and the ones who have often get it wrong in one key way that kills all the benefits. I want to talk to you today about a method called Bokashi, but I'm going to take you much deeper than the typical introduction, because the typical introduction leaves out the most important parts: the science, the history, the reason this technique was almost entirely lost outside of East Asia, and the specific trick that makes it work faster, smell better, and produce richer results than conventional composting alone. Stay with me through the first 10 minutes, because the actual how-to doesn't make sense until you understand why your current compost pile is fighting against itself. Let me start with a problem you probably already feel, but might not have named yet. You've been told that composting is simple. Browns and greens, moisture and air, turn it every week. And it works, eventually. But there are things nobody really talks about. The smell when something goes wrong. The slow pace during a cold winter. The fact that meat and dairy are completely off limits. The pile that looked beautiful last spring and now smells like a wet dog buried something in it. And the deeper problem. Most of the nitrogen in your kitchen scraps, the living, biological richness that makes compost actually valuable to your soil, is leaving before it ever reaches your garden bed. Nitrogen off-gases as ammonia when organic matter sits and decays aerobically, which is exactly what happens in a traditional pile. A study published in the journal Bioresource Technology found that conventional composting can lose up to 63% of the nitrogen content of food waste to the atmosphere before the finished compost is even ready to apply. 63%. That's not a small leak. That's most of the fuel. And here's the part that's rarely said out loud. The composting industry. The bags of compost starter, the activator powders, the expensive tumbling bins. None of that addresses this core loss. It can't, because the loss is structural. It's built into the aerobic decomposition process itself. The traditional compost pile is an aerobic system. It uses oxygen. Bacteria that need air break down organic matter. And as they do, they emit carbon dioxide, water vapor, and yes, ammonia. This is why a hot pile smells the way it does. The smell is nitrogen leaving. There's a completely different category of decomposition that humans have been exploiting for thousands of years in food preservation. Anaerobic fermentation. No oxygen. Different microbes. Profoundly different outputs. Think of the difference between leaving a piece of bread out on your counter. Aerobic decomposition. It molds, it rots. It eventually turns to dust, versus making sourdough, where you take that same flour and water and intentionally cultivate a living culture of beneficial bacteria that transform it into something stable, nutritious, alive, and actually useful. That's what Bokashi does to your food scraps. It doesn't rot them. It ferments them. The word Bokashi is Japanese. It means something close to fading or gradual shading, the way one thing transitions smoothly into another. As a composting method, it comes specifically from the work of a Japanese microbiologist named Dr. Teruo Higa, who in the 1980s began formalizing and documenting a system of beneficial microorganisms that farmers in East Asia had been using, in various form, for over 1,000 years. Dr. Higa called his formulation EM1, or effective microorganisms. The core players are three categories of bacteria and yeast: lactic acid bacteria, phototrophic bacteria, and yeast. Working together, anaerobically, in a slightly acidic environment, they don't break down organic matter so much as they preserve and predigest it. Here's the key distinction. And this is the thing that changes how you think about your whole composting system. Bokashi doesn't turn your food scraps into finished compost. It turns them into pre-compost, a fermented, inoculated, pH-adjusted material that finishes in the soil itself in a matter of weeks, rather than in a pile over months. The ancient practice of burying fermented organic matter into soil to improve it predates Dr. Higa's formalization by centuries. In traditional Korean farming, a practice called haksatang involved burying specially fermented plant and animal materials, sometimes including what we'd now call kitchen waste, directly into planting holes. The Japanese had similar traditions in regions like Nagano Prefecture, where rice bran and fish scraps were layered and fermented before soil application. These weren't composting techniques in the Western sense. They were soil inoculation techniques. The microbiology is only now catching up to what those farmers already knew empirically. Fermented organic matter, buried in soil, dramatically outperforms air-dried or conventionally composted material in terms of soil biology stimulation. A 2009 study by researchers at the University of Hawaii looked at Bokashi versus conventional compost when applied to poor volcanic soil. They found that Bokashi-treated plots showed significantly faster microbial community establishment and greater plant-available nitrogen than plots treated with conventional compost of equal nitrogen content. The fermented material wasn't just delivering nutrients. It was delivering a microbiome. And here's the mechanism that makes this almost counterintuitive. When you ferment your kitchen scraps with lactic acid bacteria, before burying them, you're doing two things at once that conventional composting can't do simultaneously. First, you're locking in the nitrogen. Lactic acid bacteria don't off-gas ammonia. They don't eat nitrogen. They preserve it in organic acid complexes. The nitrogen stays in the material through the fermentation phase. When you bury that material and soil microbes begin processing it, the nitrogen is released slowly and in plant-available forms, rather than blasting off into the air the moment temperatures rise in a hot pile. Second, you're seeding the soil with a population of beneficial microorganisms that soil biologists now recognize as keystone species in healthy agricultural soils. Lactic acid bacteria are not just composting assistants. They suppress pathogenic fungi. They break down complex carbohydrates. They produce growth-promoting compounds, including a range of organic acids and enzymes that directly stimulate root growth. Think of it this way. A conventional compost pile is a kitchen that processes ingredients before serving them to your soil. Bokashi is more like giving your soil a living starter culture, the way a baker passes sourdough starter from loaf to loaf. Each application enriches the environment for the next one. Now, here's the wait-a-minute fact I promised you earlier. Ready? Bokashi can ferment meat, fish, dairy, and cooked food. If you've been composting for any length of time, your entire system just tilted slightly. Those are the forbidden categories. You've been told never to add them to a compost pile because they attract pests, create harmful pathogens, and generate smells bad enough to cause neighborhood complaints. And in an aerobic compost pile, that's entirely true. The fats in dairy and the proteins in meat create exactly the wrong conditions for aerobic bacteria. They produce a catastrophically wrong-smelling chemical cascade and invite every rat in the county. But in an anaerobic, acidic Bokashi environment, those same proteins and fats are fermented differently. The lactic acid environment suppresses the bacterial species responsible for putrefaction. The proteins get partially hydrolyzed, broken down into shorter chains, by the yeast and bacteria in the culture. The fats get saponified, converted into soap-like compounds that are actually beneficial to soil structure. This matters because roughly a third of what most households throw away is animal-derived food. If you've been leaving that third out of your soil amendment system, you've been operating with one hand behind your back. Let me go deeper into the actual science of what happens during fermentation, because this is where the method really earns its complexity. When you layer kitchen scraps in a sealed container and add Bokashi bran, which is rice bran or wheat bran inoculated with those effective microorganisms, you're creating a controlled anaerobic fermentation. The container must be airtight. That's not a suggestion. Even small amounts of oxygen will shift the microbial balance from lactic acid fermentation toward aerobic decomposition, and that's when smell problems begin. Over the next 10 to 14 days, the lactic acid bacteria dominate the environment. They produce lactic acid as a byproduct of metabolizing the sugars in your food scraps. This drops the pH of the entire mass, typically to somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5. At that pH level, pathogenic bacteria essentially cannot survive. Not harmful E. coli, not salmonella, not the molds that would otherwise colonize rotting food. Here's the remarkable thing about pH 3.5. That's roughly the acidity of wine. We don't worry about pathogens surviving in wine. The same principle applies here. The fermentation creates its own sterile environment through chemistry, not through heat, the way a hot compost pile does. And unlike a hot pile, which must reach 131 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit and maintain that temperature for several days to achieve pathogen kill, Bokashi does it at room temperature, in your kitchen, in winter. This is not a minor logistical point. Traditional composting in cold climates essentially stops from November through March. The microbial activity shuts down below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Your food scraps pile up with nowhere meaningful to go. Bokashi ferments equally well at 40 degrees as it does at 80. The lactic acid bacteria don't care what's happening outside your kitchen window. Now, here's where most online guides to Bokashi stop. They tell you to seal your bucket, wait 2 weeks, and then bury the material. And that's technically correct, but it leaves out 3 critical variables that determine whether your results are spectacular or disappointing. The first is compression. This is the single most important technique that most beginners miss. Every time you add a new layer of kitchen scraps, you need to press it down firmly, tightly, before adding your bran and sealing the lid. Why? Because air pockets in your bucket are enemy number 1. Every pocket of oxygen that remains in the material is a pocket where aerobic bacteria can outcompete your lactic acid culture. You want that material packed as densely as possible, like pressing a snowball, firm, no air gaps. I'll go into the full step-by-step in detail in a few minutes. But hold that thought, because the second variable is even more important, and it relates to something you probably already have in your kitchen right now. The second variable is the inoculant quality. Not all Bokashi bran is equal, not even close. Commercially available Bokashi bran from garden centers is often old, poorly stored, and carrying a much weaker microbial population than what you'd find in a fresh homemade batch. And I want to be direct about this. The degraded microbial counts in poorly stored commercial bran are one of the primary reasons people try Bokashi once and conclude it doesn't work. The organisms in Bokashi, lactic acid bacteria especially, are alive. They have a shelf life. They require storage away from heat, away from moisture, and away from direct sunlight. The bag of Bokashi bran sitting under fluorescent lights at your local garden center, at room temperature potentially for months? That's a gamble. And a fresh batch, made at home in about 10 minutes, using molasses and a culture medium, will outperform it every time. That's the advanced variation I'll give you in the practical section. It's not complicated, and it costs a fraction of what commercial bran costs annually. The third variable is drainage. Here's something that surprises new Bokashi practitioners. The fermentation process produces a liquid. A lot of it. As the microorganisms work through your food scraps, moisture is released, and the acidic liquid, often called Bokashi tea or Bokashi juice, collects at the bottom of the container. This liquid is extraordinary. pH around 3.5 to 4, loaded with lactic acid, organic acids, beneficial microorganisms, and plant-available nutrients. Diluted at a ratio of roughly 1 to 100 with water, it works as a soil drench and a mild pathogen suppressant. Applied full strength to drains and pipes, it breaks down organic buildup without chemicals. But if you don't drain it regularly, every 2 to 3 days, it can back up into your fermenting material, create anaerobic conditions that are too extreme, even for lactic acid bacteria, and tip the balance toward undesirable fermentation. Your Bokashi bucket should have a valve or spigot at the bottom, or you should transfer material to a strainer periodically. This is not optional. The liquid management is half the system. Have you ever tried Bokashi before? Drop it in the comments. I want to know what worked and what didn't, because the community knowledge on this one is genuinely valuable, and a lot of people are running into the same 3 problems without realizing it. Let me talk for a moment about what happens to your fermented material after the bucket, because this is where the magic of the system becomes visible. The Bokashi material, after 2 weeks of fermentation, doesn't look or smell like finished compost. It looks like pickled vegetables, still recognizable, slightly acidic in smell, darker in color. It's not finished. It's ready to begin. When you bury that material, and I'll explain exactly how deep and in what configuration, it enters what Bokashi practitioners call the secondary stage. Soil microbes, particularly fungi and bacteria that specialize in processing high-acid organic material, colonize the fermented mass within days. The soil itself provides the finishing environment. The pH of the buried material neutralizes rapidly as it reacts with soil minerals, typically within 1 to 2 weeks. As it does, the nitrogen compounds that were locked in the lactic acid fermentation become available to your plants in a cascade. Not all at once. In a sustained release pattern that is closer to the way forest soils feed trees than the way synthetic fertilizers feed annual crops. Here's the part I want you to pay close attention to, because this is the practical payoff for everything we've discussed. You'll need a Bokashi bucket, specifically a 5-gallon airtight container with a spigot at the bottom, or 2 nested buckets where the inner one is perforated and the outer one collects liquid. These run about $15 to $20 new, or you can make your own from food-grade 5-gallon buckets for under $5 at a hardware store. You'll need Bokashi bran, either purchased or homemade, which I'll describe. And you'll need a small scale or a tablespoon measure, a source of unchlorinated water, and molasses if you're making your own bran. For the homemade bran, and I want to be clear, this is the version I use and recommend, you need wheat bran or rice bran, inexpensive at most Asian grocery stores, unsulfured blackstrap molasses, water that's been left to sit overnight so chlorine has off-gassed, and either a commercial EM, 1 starter culture, or a small amount of lacto-fermented material, homemade yogurt, kefir, or the liquid from a jar of properly fermented sauerkraut, all work. You're essentially farming the lactobacillus that already exists in fermented foods and multiplying it onto a carrier medium. To make the bran, dissolve 1 tablespoon of molasses into 1 cup of unchlorinated water. Stir in 2 tablespoons of your lactoculture. Pour this liquid slowly over 2 pounds of dry bran, mixing as you go, until the bran is uniformly damp but not wet. It should hold its shape when you squeeze it, but not drip. Pack this into an airtight bag or jar, seal it, and leave it at room temperature for 2 to 3 weeks. You'll know it's ready when it smells slightly sour and sweet, like a fermented food, not like garbage. This batch will inoculate your kitchen scraps for months. Store your finished bran in a cool, dry place. In the refrigerator, it will stay active for up to 6 months. Now, for the bucket protocol. The layer thickness matters more than most guides admit. Your scraps should go in no deeper than 2 to 3 inches per layer. This is because the Bokashi organisms are surface active. They colonize the interface between scraps and bran. And if your layers are too thick, the interior of the mass doesn't get properly inoculated, and you'll get uneven fermentation with pockets of incorrect activity. Chop or cut your scraps into pieces no larger than an inch or two. Surface area accelerates fermentation significantly. Add your scraps. Compress firmly with a potato masher, a flat-bottom jar, or your fist. Add 1 to 2 tablespoons of Bokashi bran per pound of material, distributing it evenly across the surface. Seal the lid immediately. Seal it every time. Even a brief exposure to air delays the establishment of the anaerobic culture. Most people get this first thing wrong. They open the bucket multiple times a day. Every time you crack that lid to add a handful of scraps, you're resetting part of the fermentation. The better practice is to collect scraps in a small, sealed container on your countertop, a ceramic crock, a stainless steel container with a gasket lid, and batch add to your Bokashi bucket every 1 to 2 days. This minimizes air exposure and allows the anaerobic culture to develop more completely between additions. The second common mistake is adding liquid. The Bokashi system is designed for solid and semi-solid food waste. Soups, stews, and watery liquids create flooding conditions in the bucket that dilute the bran inoculant and can shift the fermentation environment incorrectly. If you have a very watery material, a smoothie, a liquid-heavy leftover, either strain it before adding or absorb it into a carrier material like shredded newspaper or cardboard. For the advanced gardener who wants to push the system further, consider what Bokashi practitioners call trench composting integration. Instead of a single trench or hole, you maintain a rotating grid of compost trenches in your growing beds. A system, sometimes called Korean natural farming trench inoculation. You dig trenches roughly 12 inches deep and 12 inches wide. Fill them with 2 to 4 inches of Bokashi material. Cover with 2 inches of compost or garden soil, and plant directly into the trench rows on a 3 to 4 week delay after burial. The buried Bokashi creates a zone of intense biological activity directly in your root zone. In a properly established system, you can cycle through an entire raised bed in one growing season, building soil fertility cumulatively each year. No synthetic inputs. No purchased amendments beyond the initial bran investment. For climate adaptation, in very cold climates, your outdoor burial can happen through most of the year because the fermented material is already microbiologically stable. You're not worried about pathogen activity or smell when it's below freezing. In tropical climates, your fermentation will move faster, sometimes ready in 10 days rather than 14. You may also experience more leakage of liquid in high humidity environments. So drain your spigot more frequently and consider keeping your bucket in a temperature-stable indoor space. In arid climates, the burial stage requires more moisture management. When you bury your fermented material, water the covering soil thoroughly and consider a layer of mulch over the trench to retain moisture. Since the soil microbes that finish the Bokashi need adequate hydration to work efficiently. One more practical note that belongs here, because it's the thing that catches experienced composters off guard. During the first 5 to 7 days after burial, you'll often notice a white fuzz growing on or near the buried material when you check it. This is not mold in any harmful sense. This is the mycelium of beneficial fungi, particularly species in the mucor and aspergillus families, that are among the first colonizers of the freshly buried acidic material. It's a sign the system is working. The white mycelial network is the visual evidence of soil biology activating. Do not dig it up. Do not disturb it. Mark the spot and walk away. What you're looking for over the weeks following burial is not dramatic above-ground change, at least not immediately. In the first week, what's happening is almost entirely underground. pH neutralization, fungal colonization, bacterial population shifts. Your soil's visible structure will start to change first. You'll notice it's darker and workable at depth, even without rain or irrigation. By week 2, if you've planted into or near the trench zone, you should begin seeing accelerated growth response in those plants compared to control areas of your garden that didn't receive treatment. Not because you've applied a fertilizer, but because you've shifted the soil biology in a way that increases the plant's ability to access nutrients that were already present, but previously locked in unavailable forms. Week 3 through week 8 is where most people have their conversion moment. This is when you start noticing that the plants over your Bokashi trenches are simply performing differently. Deeper color in the leaves, indicating stronger chlorophyll production. Root development that holds the soil in a visible mass when you pull a plant rather than crumbling apart. Resistance to transplant shock. And in many cases, particularly with vegetables in heavy clay or nutrient-poor soils, yields that exceed what you've gotten from the same beds using conventional compost or fertilizer. I want to be honest about what might look like failure in this period. If you see yellowing in the week immediately following burial and planting, and your plants are very close to the trench, within 6 inches, this can be a burn response from the still active acids in the fermenting material. The solution isn't to panic or dig it up. Move your planting zone outward by another 8 to 10 inches, and the issue resolves within a week as the pH stabilizes. What you've done is something that took me a while to fully appreciate. You haven't just made compost. You haven't just recycled kitchen scraps. You've inserted a living culture into your soil, a microbial population that will persist and reproduce across multiple growing seasons if you keep feeding it. You've turned your garden bed into a perpetual fermentation environment, one where the soil itself begins to behave more like the dark, biologically complex floor of a temperate forest than the inert substrate that most annual garden beds degenerate into over time. And you've done it with materials that were going into the garbage. The coffee grounds that otherwise go into a landfill where they generate methane. The fish bones from Friday's dinner that used to go in the trash because nobody told you they were acceptable. The cheese rinds and eggshells that the compost pile couldn't handle. All of it is now soil, now fertility, now food for the next generation of plants. There's something I keep coming back to when I think about these ancient practices. Bokashi, Korean natural farming. The Indian practice of jivamrut, traditional Andean composting in the midden pits that archaeologists still marvel at. Every one of these systems, developed independently, across cultures that never communicated, arrived at the same core insight. The soil is not a medium. It is an organism. Your job as a farmer or a gardener is not to feed the plant. It is to feed the biology that feeds the plant. Modern industrial agriculture treated this as a primitive misconception, added chemical precision, measured inputs and outputs in terms of NPK, optimized for yield at scale and ignored everything it couldn't measure. And it worked for a generation or two. Then the biology crashed and the doses had to go up, and the dependency became structural. What's remarkable is not that Bokashi is an ancient secret being rediscovered. It's that the rediscovery is happening quietly, in backyards and community gardens and small farms all over the world, simultaneously and organically, because people started paying attention to what their soil was actually doing. Because they found that a bucket and some rice bran and 2 weeks of patience was giving them results that 50 pounds of fertilizer couldn't. You now know something that most gardeners around you don't. Not because it was hidden. Dr. Higa published it decades ago. The Korean natural farming practitioners have been demonstrating it publicly for years. But because the information ecosystem around gardening still runs on assumptions that were set by an agricultural industry that benefits from you buying inputs, not cultivating biology. Share this with someone whose garden has plateaued. Someone who's been composting for years and is starting to feel like they're spinning their wheels. The breakthrough they're looking for isn't a new fertilizer, it's this. If you've made it this far, you already know that what we're building here goes beyond any single technique. Next video, we're going underground, literally, to look at the mycelium networks that make or break soil health in ways that even the Bokashi system only scratches the surface of. What's happening beneath your feet in the dark, between roots and fungal threads, is arguably the most important story in modern horticulture. And most gardeners will never see it, because nobody told them where to look. Subscribe, because that's exactly what we do here. We dig up what they thought was buried for good.